sports. You say, hey, when there's a problem, you call a man. The Democrats can't even tell you what a man is.
So when you hear Walz brag about how much of a man he is, what does that tell you?
I think there might be a little bit of a cope there, you could say. There's a little bit, he has to remind us how masculine he is, trying to not even be able to load a shotgun or...
We were getting scary close to people justifying totalitarian measures.
I think we need to push back on this.
Tim Walz in the campaign trail was literally saying free speech doesn't include hate speech and misinformation.
There's no guarantee to free speech on misinformation or hate speech, and especially around our democracy.
Hey man, you. Because everything that we called misinformation just a few years ago, it's on the front page of the New York Times now.
And keep men out of women's sports. That's something they say. Walz clearly doesn't do. Rogan and Kirk don't hold back when calling out political nonsense. And when they focused on Tim Walz, it was like watching two skilled workers dismantle a broken machine. One used experience and real-world sense. The other used facts and sharp questions. Together, they showed that Walz's time in office is more of a warning than a success story. They even joked about how Walz once claimed
that you have one rule for Facebook and you have a different rule for Twitter. There has to be the responsibility.
They bring in her and they bring in this other guy who's radical from Minnesota. That's the vice president. The New York Times just printed a thing. It turns out we were lied to.
He believes a lot of wild things. One of them is transgender surgery for people who are under 13. Another one is abortion up until 9 months.
Masculine thing that someone can do in America today is stand up for women that are not able to stand up for themselves.
Right.
So while Tim Walz is going on Gavin Newsom's podcast, attacking me, by the way, saying that I'm a bad guy, well, I'm sorry, Governor Walz. One thing that we don't have in common is, unlike you in Minnesota, I, every single day, am actually fighting for female privacy in locker rooms and that women's sports will not have men in them. Real men stand up for women when they're not able to.
Out how social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter play by different rules, with no accountability, and how that kind of unchecked power leads to lies and confusion. One of them pointed to a New York Times piece that admitted the public had been misled, saying, yeah, you lied to us. Then they talked about something they believe matters, even more standing up for women. While Tim Walz was on Gavin Newsom's podcast calling one of them a bad guy, they made it clear, real men defend women's privacy in locker rooms.
Did you say you could fight any Trump supporter?
Yeah, he says he kicked their ass and they're scared of him because he could fix a truck. Like they're threatened by his masculinity. I know how to fix a truck. That's what he said. I'm like, do you? I bet you don't.
The lady doth protest too much.
I bet you don't.
I fear.
I bet if I bring a broken truck to you and a bag of tools, you're
Joe Rogan approaches it like a man who has seen a few too many smoke and mirror acts in his life. He is not impressed by appearances or polished speeches. He cares about results, about consequences, and about reality over illusion. And with Tim Walz, the illusion is exactly the problem. Rogan unpacks Walz's governing style like he is reviewing a bizarre conspiracy theory that somehow managed to get voted into office.
There's video of Tim Walz doing the exact same thing.
Right.
Exact same thing. And he said, of course, it's a Nazi salute. He said that.
Right.
We spent 3 days debating, having them trying to debate that President Musk gave a Nazi salute. Of course he did. But that is a distraction.
This is how crazy things have gotten. Like,
it's core.
They didn't just criticize Tim Walz, they tore him apart. Joe Rogan and Charlie Kirk went through his talking points like a tornado ripping through paper. It wasn't a debate. It was a complete breakdown of his ideas using facts, common sense, and zero patience for political nonsense. Walz came in with catchy one-liners, but Rogan and Kirk brought hard truth and sharp thinking. When they were done, there was nothing left except the sound of his arguments falling apart. They also called out students with the basics. School became about everything except learning. Joe adds that Walz runs the state like a cheap survival movie where the hero keeps ignoring the obvious exits. He says Walz would rather send a long email about safety than help someone who just got hurt. Joe says Walz tries to look good online instead of fixing real problems. They even joke about how Walz changed the state flag to look like a Somali flag. Joe and Charlie say Walz seems more interested in trending on social media than listening to regular people. Charlie calls Walz a politician who reads books about perfect societies and thinks he can copy them in real life. He says Walz acts like the government knows better than parents or business owners. Joe says Walz talks like a guy who just broke something and then gives a speech about safety afterward. Charlie adds that Walz always blames someone else. Himself, he'd trip over his own shoes and blame the shoe company. Joe says Walz doesn't understand regular people because he's stuck in his own world. He compares it to running a farm based on Yelp reviews. From the outside, things look okay, but on the inside, it's chaos. Charlie ends by saying that Kamala Harris might be the worst vice president ever, and if Walz were her backup, it'd be even worse. Walz cares more about giving speeches than solving problems. He speaks softly but messes things up big time. Minnesota, once a strong and proud state, has become an example of what not to do. Together, Joe Rogan and Charlie Kirk don't just make fun of Walz, they take apart his whole way of leading. They show that too much control and too little awareness can ruin a state.
He's 100% right with Tim Walz.
I know I'm doing something right when the Fox News crowd is all pitching at me like crazy. Like, I'm loving it.
That guy was almost the vice president of the United States.
Elon Musk was crying last week. Tim is being mean to me, basically, like, yeah.
I'm sure you've seen that thing where it shows Obama saying, I need a vice president.
The family split apart by chaos and confusion. The health directives that contradicted themselves weekly. Joe lays it out like a puzzle, except all the pieces are from different boxes, and Walz insists it still looks like a beautiful picture. And then, Charlie Kirk walks in with his sleeves rolled up and a stack of receipts. Where Joe uses street-level wisdom and humor, Charlie brings the sharpness of political combat. He is less about the laughs and more about the takedown. Charlie steps up like a prosecutor, laying out a case against a defendant who has already confessed through sheer incompetence. Charlie opens fire on Walz's economic policies, or rather the lack of them. Minnesota, under Walz, became a test site for how quickly you can scare investment out of a state. Charlie paints the picture of a governor who acts like businesses are the problem, not the lifeblood of a functioning economy. While other states were reopening and rebuilding, Walz was issuing press statements about equity and climate justice, while the small business community was desperately trying to keep the lights on. Charlie finds this hilarious and horrifying at the same time.
That Tim Walz cocksucker, if that guy got into power, like if Kamala died and Tim Walz, Tampon Tim, was our fucking president, you know how crazy this country would be? That weirdo who puts tampons in the boys' room, and what about our joy? Like, he's a complete pathological liar, like a complete liar. Lied about being in Tiananmen Square, lied about being a fucking...
Tucker Carlson doesn't need a reason to make fun of a politician, especially when that politician basically sets himself up for it. That's what happened with Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, who acts like the responsible adult in the room, but governs more like a teenager who found the liquor stash. For Tucker Carlson and Greg Gutfeld, making fun of Walz isn't just finite sport. Carlson jokes that saying Walz wasn't woke enough is like telling Joy Behar she doesn't eat enough chips, or like Bud Light asking for more Dylan Mulvaney. In other words, it's a joke that writes itself. Gutfeld kicks off the roast. With his usual humor, he makes fun of Walz for being a boring excuse-maker rather than a real leader. One woman even stood up during a show and said she went to jail for peacefully opening her business during the lockdowns, and asked Tucker what he would have done. Tucker told her he hoped he would have done the same, calling her actions brave and necessary. Gutfeld uses Walz's poor decisions as comedy material. He says Walz dodges responsibility and acts like someone allergic to being held accountable. He jokes that Walz shut down the state like it was a prison, while letting crime run wild in downtown Minneapolis. He mocks Walz for calling out old white men, saying it's odd because Walz is one
when
himself.
When they decided that J.D. Vance was
compares
weird.
that to Maxine Waters mocking someone for buying cheap wigs.
Oh,
it doesn't make sense.
Guy. Meanwhile,
Gutfeld continues by pointing out Walz's double standards.
You don't think that guy's
During
weird?
COVID, he made
He's
strange
weird
rules,
in every
down
way.
small
The way he
shops,
walks, the way he waves
stores
his
stay
hands.
open, as if the virus only went to mom and pop businesses. Gutfeld says Walz handled COVID rules like a confused DJ, changing things constantly with no logic. Then he takes on education in Minnesota. Gutfeld says schools are focused more on feelings than facts, and that test scores in reading and math dropped a lot under Walz. He jokes that the only thing growing in schools was government red tape. He also makes fun of how equity has replaced real learning. Gutfeld says it's like saying 2 + 2 = whatever won't hurt someone's feelings. He calls Walz's education approach the Zoom class version of everyone gets a trophy. Next, Gutfeld moves to the economy. He says Walz's policies drove businesses out of Minnesota and raised taxes too high. Gutfeld jokes that it looked like Walz was trying to scare away success, and it worked. By the end, he says Walz isn't a leader, just a good example of how far someone average can rise. If they smile enough during press conferences, then it's Carlson's turn. He gets more serious, but still cuts deep. Carlson says Walz has a habit of lying, starting with small things, like pretending he was a high-ranking officer in the military when he wasn't. Carlson says, People who lie about small things usually lie about big things too. Carlson brings up the massive drop in Minneapolis police numbers since George Floyd's death, down nearly 40%. He says that even though voters didn't officially vote to defund the police, the result was the same. Officers left, crime rose, and the government handed things over to activists. It wasn't leadership, it was Walz stepping aside and hoping for the best. Carlson then criticizes Walz's COVID response. While Gutfeld joked about it, Carlson takes a more serious look, saying Walz made things worse by trying to fix problems with bad ideas and confusing orders. He ends by reminding viewers how George Floyd's death changed the country, and 5 years later, Tim Walz is still the governor. Carlson seems to suggest that things haven't improved. In fact, they've gotten worse. The police officers convicted of killing George Floyd are still in prison, even though many people now believe they were wrongly convicted. Meanwhile, the city of Minneapolis has suffered a lot, but hardly anyone talks about it. There's also a story about someone connected to Governor Tim Walz. He served on a board related to jobs and workforce development. He was first picked by former Governor Mark Dayton and later reappointed by Walz. But the board spot ended in 2023. It's not clear if Walz and this man actually knew each other. Interestingly, other state officials were also on that board, so they may have met. Tucker Carlson talks about how Walz ran Minnesota during COVID. He criticizes Walz for closing churches but keeping liquor stores open. He says the governor acted more like a daycare worker than a real leader. According to Carlson, Walz treated Minnesotans like children, telling them what to think, when to be scared, and when they were allowed to leave their homes. Carlson also says Walz's updates sounded like something from a creepy science fiction movie. Every new rule from Walz came with a message like, just trust us, which Carlson clearly doesn't. Then he looks at education. Carlson says schools under Walz focused more on politics than teaching. Test scores fell, but schools kept pushing lessons that made kids dislike their own state's history. He calls it brainwashing, dressed up as learning. To Carlson, Walz isn't a real leader. He's someone who follows the crowd and does what he's told by elites. Carlson jokes that Walz acts like a hall monitor who somehow ended up in charge. Carlson also highlights a strange moment where Walz greets his wife in a weird way at a public event, which he plays for laughs. Greg Gutfeld adds more jokes, saying Walz is full of empty words. He mocks how Walz talks about following the science to defend his policies, but only the parts of science that match what he wants to do. Gutfeld points out that during the pandemic, people couldn't hug their grandkids, but they could wait in line at the DMV. Gutfeld also jokes that Walz tried to turn Minnesota into a testing ground for climate change ideas that don't work and cost a lot. He says Walz blames nature when the power goes out, instead of taking responsibility. Carlson continues by saying that Walz made government jobs safe and high-paying, while small businesses struggled and closed. He says Minnesota's economy suffered under Walz's rules, and it wasn't fair. They also find it strange that a man who worked at 7-Eleven and in a funeral home ended up on a governor-appointed board. It raises questions about how appointments are made in the state. Gutfeld and Carlson take turns making fun of Walz's social media posts, saying they feel out of touch, like an old relative trying to be cool online but missing the mark. Carlson ends by saying the real problem isn't that Walz is evil, it's that he truly believes he's doing good, but believing something is right doesn't mean it is. Walz keeps blaming the rules when his plans don't work, instead of fixing what went wrong. In the end, their roast isn't just for laughs, it's a warning. Being a leader isn't about making speeches or looking busy. It's about making the right choices when it matters. They didn't just criticize Tim Walz, they tore him apart. Joe Rogan and Charlie Kirk went through his talking points like a tornado ripping through paper. It wasn't a debate. It was a complete breakdown of his ideas using facts, common sense, and zero patience for political nonsense. Walz came in with catchy one-liners, but Rogan and Kirk brought hard truth and sharp thinking. When they were done, there was nothing left except the sound of his arguments falling apart. They also called out how social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter play by different rules, with no accountability, and how that kind of unchecked power leads to lies and confusion. One of them pointed to a New York Times piece that admitted the public had been misled, saying, "Yeah, you lied to us." Then they talked about something they believe matters even more, standing up for women. While Tim Walz was on Gavin Newsom's podcast calling one of them a bad guy, they made it clear, real men defend women's privacy in locker rooms and keep men out of women's sports. That's something they say Walz clearly doesn't do. Rogan and Kirk don't hold back when calling out political nonsense. And when they focused on Tim Walz, it was like watching two skilled workers dismantle a broken machine. One used experience and real-world sense. The other used facts and sharp questions. Together, they showed that Walz's time in office is more of a warning than a success story. They even joked about how Walz once claimed he could beat up any Trump supporter and fix a truck like a pro. Rogan called that out, saying, "I bet you can't." It sounded like someone trying too hard to prove something. Rogan isn't impressed by speeches or surface evil charm. He cares about what's real, what works, and what doesn't. And with Tim Walz, what he sees is a lot of image and not much substance. It's like Walz is always trying to look like he's in control, even when things are falling apart. Joe made fun of how Walz handled the pandemic. Joe, who's talked to tons of experts and everyday people, saw right through it. He said Walz acted like the pandemic was a chance to play a hero on TV instead of actually helping people. And that's the main point. Rogan and Kirk showed that Tim Walz cares more about how things look than how they really are. And when it comes to leadership, that's a big problem. Have you seen that video where people talk about why they like Donald Trump? It's because he says what he thinks, even if it's shocking. They joke that Governor Tim Walz isn't there to defend himself, but if he were, he'd probably say he was. One of the jokes is about how some Democrats say men can have periods. And then someone says, "Then I met Tim Walz." They say Minnesota became a place where gyms were closed, but big stores stayed open. Joe Rogan makes fun of that by asking how a virus knows not to spread in Walmart but goes wild in small shops or barber shops. Joe also talks about how Governor Walz acted like he couldn't let go of power. He jokes that Walz held on to emergency powers like a kid holding the remote control. There was no common sense, just fear-based rules. Joe says Walz led like a weatherman, stuck in a basement, guessing what was happening outside. Joe points out how Walz made odd decisions, and instead of fixing things, he doubled down on them. It became more like watching a bad sci-fi movie. But Joe isn't just joking, he also talks about how businesses closed and never reopened under Walz's leadership. Then, Charlie Kirk joins in. He's more serious. He talks like a lawyer giving proof that Walz failed. He says Walz scared off businesses, acted like business owners were the problem, and cared more about talking points like climate justice than helping the economy. Charlie and Joe both laugh at how Walz might have become vice president if things had gone differently. They say he's a strange guy with strange ideas, like putting tampons in boys' bathrooms, supporting gender surgeries for kids under 13, and allowing abortion up to 9 months. Charlie says, under Walz, Minnesota schools focused more on political lessons than reading or math. Test scores dropped, but the state hired more diversity officers instead of helping